Tell me when it's 30 seconds to
Junior, and tonight we're very proud to bring you the poetry of Isabel Rivera. Isabel's a student at Cornell University and a promising poet. Good evening, Ms. Rivera, and welcome to Poets Cafe.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here.
Starting off, I'd like to ask, as our audience would like to know, I'm sure, how long have you been writing poetry?
I always consider this how long have I been creative writing question for some reason. I've been writing creatively since I was 12, and I started my first poem when I was 15. So about 6 years.
So, what types of writing have you done except for poetry? I know since you said creatively writing.
Yeah, I've done short story writing mainly, and some poetic prose, but that's been more just dabbling.
Yeah. I remember in our pre-interview you mentioned the first poem you ever had published was French, and after that you wrote into Spanish, and then you moved on to English. What was the reason for starting in French or even Spanish and then moving to English?
Well, it's an interesting question. When I got my first poem published, it was called The Hour Before Immortality. Yeah. I was a depressed 15-year-old in high school. Yeah. And I remember that, well, I was led by visions in art. And when I first picked up that pencil as our pen, as an assignment for a French class, to write just a poem that would then in turn be submitted to a French-American journal for a contest. I wasn't thinking anything. I thought, gosh, I just have this vision. I have to write it down. I don't care if it's French that I'm writing in. And I remember this kind of purity of thought at 15, just to have fun with it and enjoy myself. And before I know it, I get this phone call from my French professor my French teacher that I got chosen. With Spanish, that was more on the personal side. Like I'm Latina. My parents are from South America, and I started writing in Spanish about the same time I started writing in French, like 15. Yeah. And I would say some of the poetry I've been writing in Spanish didn't really satisfy me. Yeah. So yeah, that's when I started writing in those other languages.
You said that you were writing for 6 years, and maturing in the physical sense is just a process of aging, but maturing creatively is much different. What do you think has led to your maturing as an artist?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think that there are so many influences. When I was 15, I could cite 4 main influences as to how I started poetry. That was this publication of this French poem that I'd had in this French-American journal. And secondly, it was my joining up with a Live Poets Society in Long Island. And it was an organization of poets. Most of them were like 30 or 40 or 50 years old. And I was like 15. They were like, what are you doing here? I found out about it because my mom, well, she knew I liked writing. And she said, well, why don't you just go? She told me about it she found it in a community bulletin posting. And since then, I received so much exposure to poets who'd been writing for a long time, 30, 40-year-old, publishers, editors, writers. And it was a time of real flourishing for me, like real blossoming, because we used to put out poetry workshops. We'd invite guest poets. We'd tour around Long Island museums, like the Walt Whitman Museum, libraries, bookstores, churches, just reading our poetry. And each week we met, each Sunday for about a couple of hours, and we all had assignments to write like a certain topic. Write about body parts one time, or write about love another time. And here I was among these really vivacious, intellectual people at 15. And that had a tremendous impact on me. I went home and I thought about all the ideas, the artsiness of some of the poets that I'd seen. So there was this one lady, she would do dramatic presentations of her art, like performance. Like if she had a collection of poems on aprons, and these were based on a collection she had of aprons in general, like from different countries, from different women's ages, like age groups, and she'd write. She'd do performances of an old grandma's apron, post-World War II, and Germany. And I remember just being struck with that, like the combination of drama and literature and expression. So that was a really big influence, and that continued for several years. Then again, there was also my mother. My mother was an extremely imaginative woman. Very good in visual quality. Like she talks and you can see what she's talking about. And also, let's see, another event happened to really spark my poetry, and that was my being exposed to the poetry of Margaret Atwood, Pablo Neruda, and A.R. Ammons. This all happened when I was 15. I found poetry issues just randomly locked away in the library, high school library. And I'd wander around it and, of course, be being kind of nerdy, you know. I'd find that I stumble upon these things, and I stumble upon this poetry, and it blew my mind. After that, I would say they remained big influences in my poetry throughout the years. But now, when we're talking about my development as a poet, hand in hand with all this exposure, I've always believed that I benefit most when I expose myself to other people's poetry, contemporary poets preferably. Although I think it's great and important to have a good background in old literature, old English literature. And since then, I was pretty public about it when I was younger. But through my years at Cornell, I kind of went through the seclusion period. And so much was happening to me as a student in my life. And I just began writing, like unstoppably. Just books, and putting out notebooks and notebooks. And I would say it's been a really almost isolated process. You're going through it alone. You're exposing yourself, you're hearing other people, but your eyes are starting to open to your own work. You go back to it, you start seeing some things that were wrong, or just like, that's terrible, what you wrote before.
I know that you mentioned A.R. Ammons and Walt Whitman, and even Pablo Neruda. Who else would you say heavily influenced you?
I would say the feminist poets. Margaret Atwood, Adrienne Rich, and conversely also like Emily Dickinson. That kind of voice, a woman's voice, contemplating herself. I would say that really haunts a lot of my poetry. A big influence.
You also mentioned the fact that when you're in the Live Poets Society, you had these workshops where you had assignments each week. Don't you feel that when you go to a workshop and someone says, go home and write about this, that doesn't really help you? creatively at all, because people are more or less forcing. Then you have to force yourself to write about something that you really don't care to write about that much.
That's a little bit cynical. No, I see your point.
Yeah.
Definitely, a lot of people have a lot of mixed ideas about workshops, that it can be sometimes just a competitive thing at the moment, who writes the best poem, given the assignment, and no one cares about the topic. I think, okay, truth be told, I didn't always write in these workshops. The best part was just seeing what other people could come up with on the spot, the language, the ideas, right there, and going home and then digesting them. And, okay, maybe they wouldn't write the most polished poems at that point, but sometimes there were topics, little things that triggered other ideas related to that topic, and then you find and then entire deviations. And so I would say that was the value, more than anything, seeing what other people could come up with.
Moving along, I was curious after reading some of your poems, because stylistically, well, not really stylistically, but as far as content and form, it's definitely not like the romantics. Well, actually in form it is like romantics, but not in content. Did you find that the romantics influenced you in any way?
There was something about the romantic style, for example, A.R. Ammons' style, that suggested to me a kind of liberty and a real open dialogue with nature.
Yeah.
My format may not be in any way conforming to romantic conventional styles. I would say I'm more influenced by the philosophy, the attitude of open dialogue with your environment, surroundings, like trees, sky, and also attributing a kind of animated quality, kind of humanizing natural forces that I think the romantics were excellent at.
Yeah.
And that's what I like to pursue in my work.
Some people have compared the process of writing a poem much like performing dental surgery on yourself. How would you describe your process of writing a poem?
That's really interesting. I once wrote a poem called Levitation, The Operation Table.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that, although I'm not sure I see the teeth part of that.
I think they were just talking about the pain and dirt.
Yeah. Sometimes when you're writing poetry, it's a process of real detachment. You're kind of lifting yourself out of your own body, your own... Somehow there's a moment of entire involvement of your feelings, because that's what poetry is about. It's dictated by this feeling you had. And yet at the same time, you have levitated enough, distanced yourself enough from the subject to be in control of what you're writing, so you can render it to the public. And there's a process of operation. Here's the body, and you're dissecting it. You're seeing what all the processes are going on inside. And you're working on it, and it's like dissection, almost.
I know in a couple periodicals that I've read recently, there have been a lot of articles about the psychology of poetry. How do you feel, about the psychology that's involved in your poetry?
Again, you're talking about the poetry process, like how it's inspired.
Yes, more or less.
Okay. I think really that's an issue I've thought about.
Yeah.
How poetry is born, what kind of subjects, inspirations trigger that almost frenzy, that almost like automatic, instinctive reaction when you write poetry. I would say for me, psychologically, what's involved is a topic, something, a symbol, an idea, a feeling that's disturbing, that recurs again and again, and it's like a problem that you want to resolve. in a poem.
Yeah.
And because you can't address it so well, it's really like working out a problem, like a math problem or something.
Yeah.
And finally, at the end, you may not feel so triumphant, but you feel like you've arrived somewhere. You've studied some internal thought in yourself, some feeling.
Yeah.
And when you see it at the end that you've put it down, you feel better.
Well,
it's there at least.
At this point in the program, we have to take a short break, and then we'll be right back with Isabel Rivera on our reading stage, and so stay tuned.
Hello, I'm going to be reading some of my works. Here is my first poem. It's called Diamonds. Pain becomes whiteness as I pass from a time of coal into diamond-like awareness, scratching and scratching windows of my refracting soul, that if rainbows could arise from my eyes, I would promise you much happiness. This poem's called Impassioned. You make me humble. You remind me of how many women came before me, ancient as I am now with you. But my heart wants to love you my way, original, uninfluenced by stories. Other times were not real. Other loves were only legends. Angles. The ocean line of water rises and disappears from its sleeping body. A man and a woman lie like rulers at angles. The birch slices the horizon with its loving, undisciplined branches. And you are like this winter tree, my love. But your eyes, the light in them, came from elsewhere, from an unangled world. Love letters. Opening, a letter was like an oyster, freshly brought from the sea of her lover's mind. There was a potential for abstraction, but they were more like eagles or falcons, together on the branch of imagination. This poem's called The Sister Tree. Everywhere I divide and branch out, I am reaching so high, my craggy fingers bearing fruit at their tips. All shoots out from my brown body, one mad, certain soul reaching out into the uncertainty, with all the force of a watermill, chopping eternity into parts. This poem is Fire Island. On the other side, beyond the hill, the sea is a bed of flaming pearls. People are walking as if they always belonged beside it, as if they knew no other place so well. Their bodies dangle so easily off this infinity, like pink-winged flamingos, leaving tiny footprints everywhere on the edges of sea-line existence. To watch them, the range of their bodies, statures, and colors walk down together towards that same trident of sky, water, and land, is to know there is something calling them down there. This poem was inspired by my father when he came to visit me in Ithaca last year. It's called To My Father, and it's prefaced by a French quote. I'll read it in French. Dieu fluvial, riant de l'eau qui le chatouille, which translates to, the river god laughs at the caressing water. And that's a quote by Henri de Régnier. To my father. I am trying to get a good picture. He doesn't smile often, you know. It's hard enough to get him to pose by this Ithaca gorge, have him dip his fingers into the marvelous water, to say, geez. His eyes, old and searching, are too dark brown to go with water, and he looks too serious and mismatched in his leather shoes and two-piece suit, beside the merry leaves, the disorganized world of undines. I fumble with the camera, mumble a dumb joke I can't even remember, and he laughs suddenly, a sunlight laugh, and his eyes crinkle like the toes of a robin in flight, and he becomes an age-old bark tree in the sky. I catch my father there forever, the water cascading triumphantly over this delighted Indian river god.
Well, I'd like to take this one last opportunity to thank Isabel Rivera for joining us this evening. And I want to remind everyone to join in next week. When our show is not going to be an interview show, but it's going to be a show about poetry on the internet. We're going to go through worldwide websites, poetry through internet relay chat. We're going to go through a couple Usenet groups and things of that sort. So everyone join in for that show next week, and thanks for joining us at the Poets Cafe.